Okay, thanks everyone coming back from the break. We are now going to have an excellent discussion here. It's going to be fascinating. Looking forward to it. Let me just quickly introduce people, and I will get out of the way. Quick announcement first. I know it's tempting to take off your masks. Please leave them on while you're in here. It's not for you. It's for everyone around you. Okay. Kat Zakrzewski will be moderating this. Did I get that right? Okay. She's a technology reporter and author of the Technology 202 newsletter. She previously reported for the Wall Street Journal Pro Venture Capital. Her work has also been published in TechCrunch, the Boston Globe, USA Today, and the Chicago Sun-Times. And she will be interviewing Michael McConnell, who is co-chair of Facebook's Oversight Board, as well as the Richard and Frances Mallory Professor and Director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School, and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Julie Owono is Executive Director of Internet Sans Frontières, an organization that defends digital rights and access to the internet. She's an expert in digital rights and international technology, law, and an advocate for business and human rights principles in the technology industry. And with that, I will let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be here today because we actually get to make a little bit of history with the first in-person panel with the Facebook Oversight Board during the pandemic. So thank you both for being here. And I wanted to start today, even though the board has issued many rulings, with the Trump decision, because it's probably the one that people here in this room are most familiar with. And so when Facebook announced in June that Trump would be suspended for 2 years, it also said that it would adopt most of the policy recommendations that the board offered in its ruling. The board said then it was encouraged, but it would closely watch how well the company did in implementing those recommendations. Now that we're a few months out, Michael, how well would you say the company is doing in implementing your recommendations?
Actually, interestingly, this has turned out, to my surprise, to be probably the most important part of what we do. I had, at the beginning, kind of assumed that our principal task was to decide, take-ups, leave-downs, specific disputes of that sort, and that recommendations were kind of a secondary. They would be a thing. And I think now that we've been in this for however long it's been, less than a year, but still, I think the recommendations are proving to be probably the most important part of what we do. We've announced over the course of 13 or so cases, on the order of 60 some odd recommendations, of which Facebook has agreed to just over 30, and is actively considering many of the others. Now, maybe 100% would be better, but I have to say it's not that we're not 100% right either, and I think that sometimes it has proven that our recommendations are maybe too vague, maybe on the impractical side, and so I am actually pretty cheerful about the record with Facebook, in that I think they've taken our recommendations seriously 100% of the time, and we are engaged in conversation with them about the others, and I think we are learning too. It's my hope that as a result of the experience with recommendations and how they are implemented, that we're going to get better at it, that the recommendations that we will be issuing in the future may be more precise, a little less utopian, more pointed, and that will be a good thing. Now, just one last thing that we decided as a result of this sort of half-full glass of implementation to create an implementation committee within the board, which is working much more hand in glove with Facebook. Much of what we do is sort of arm's length, but the implementation committee, and actually Julie should be the one talking about it, because she's on that and I'm not. But that's the whole point of that is to work with them and keeping their feet to the fire, but also being practical and trying to work out how to make the recommendations make much more of a difference.
And Julie, on that point, can you tell us a little bit more about that committee and also just your assessment of how well Facebook's doing so far in implementing what the board has directed them to do?
Yes, sure. The implementation working group, from my perspective, shows the extent to which the board is actually a living instrument, very agile. We've been from a point in which we made recommendations without really asking ourselves about the challenges that the company could face in implementing them. But then the conversation evolved to, yes, we have to be impactful, especially since Facebook is committed to implementing the recommendations. This was not an obvious fact when the board launched, because as you may be aware, the board has two, competencies. On the one hand, we make binding decisions on one content concerning one user, one appeal. And that is a binding aspect of our decisions that Facebook has to implement. But then we make recommendations that are non-binding. And the fact that they were non-binding was kind of, for me, a big worry when I joined the board. But I'm, like Michael said, we are extremely satisfied to see the efforts that the company is making. And one of the very striking aspect of this efforts is recently the company has launched a transparency center, which was a big step, because we've been from a point in which to understand how Facebook was implementing its own community standards and enforcing them, you had to look at scattered, documents that were scattered all around on the internet, on newsroom, website of the company, It was very difficult from a user's perspective. And one of the big recommendations of the board has been to push Facebook to be more transparent and to be more meaningfully transparent. Not just throwing out figures and saying, oh, we're great, but also explaining better and making sure that the users could understand what is actually happening from a content moderation perspective. And I think, yes, for me, this is a sign in the good direction on the efficiency of the recommendations that we make to the company.
And Julie, I wanted to ask specifically about one of those recommendations, which was for Facebook to review its role in the election fraud narrative that sparked the violence on January 6th. The company said that it would implement this in part, but I wanted to ask you about what we've seen in recent weeks when the company cut off NYU researchers who were researching that very issue. What do you make of that situation, and what does it say about the company's commitments to the board?
So we don't have a board position on that particular issue. So I will speak here specifically as an activist. I, as an activist, have advocated and continue to advocate for, like I was saying, more transparency from the part of the company. And one way to achieve that is to collaborate with outside, observers who are not within the Facebook machine and can criticize, can find critical loopholes in this content moderation space. And yes, I would say it's probably, our experience has shown that when, especially in the content moderation space, when there is more collaborations between different actors from different industries with different backgrounds, so not only companies on their side doing their thing, not only politicians on their side doing their things, regulating sometimes without touch with reality, excuse me, I will be very frank here, and also civil society organizations advocating on their side, well, that's not necessarily efficient from my perspective and from the experience we've had. On the contrary, what is more efficient is when all these stakeholders collaborate together on the content moderation debate. And yes, that would be my answer to that. I think multi-stakeholderism in the content moderation space is extremely important to be efficient.
Do you agree, Michael?
Yes, I don't really feel qualified to comment on the particular NYU researcher issue. It hasn't come before us. I know only what I read in the papers, so I'm no more informed on that than anyone else. What Facebook has said is that those researchers were not following the sort of rules set down for how researchers are supposed to use Facebook data. Facebook is obviously very, it was burned by the Cambridge Analytica catastrophe, and I think that is making them more cautious. From what I've read in the newspapers, it's impossible for me to tell whether that's whether Facebook's explanation is actually full and complete or not. I certainly agree with Julie's broader points about the need to engage a number of different actors with respect to policy changes at Facebook. The number of issues and problems and glitches and oddities and idiocies and so forth is really quite large, and and in order to make, and it's so important to, 1 billion people around the world, right? Very important that that this platform be managed in an intelligent way, and many, and that's why experts and users and activists and civil society and researchers and ordinary users really need to all have their voices heard on a number of issues. So yeah, I agree with that.
And one thing I wanted to ask you, so you're now doing more to track whether or not Facebook is effectively implementing your recommendations, but as Julie mentioned, these recommendations aren't binding. So if they're not living up to their promises to the board, what power do you have to address that? What do you do?
Oh, well, I don't think that means they're not, because they're not binding, they didn't make promises, right? So they're not violating promises when they don't implement these things. And the only enforcement is this, but I want to tell you, I think it's a pretty powerful enforcement, which is that people are paying attention. So when we make recommendations, these do not go unnoticed. It is not the tree falling in the forest where nobody hears. The recommendations are noticed, people watch, Facebook responds within 30 days, and when they when they disagree, they give a reason, and when they are not persuasive and don't seem to be stepping up to the plate, it's not good for them. They suffer a public relations hit among the most important sort of observers for their business. And thus far, I mean, it's too early to tell, but thus far, I think that is a pretty good enforcement device.
I would tend to agree with Michael, and I would even go as far as saying that, so coming from the perspective, again, of an activist who has been engaging with social media platforms, and particularly Facebook, the big difference between the non-binding recommendations to which Facebook has to respond, that's an obligation, and the engagement that we used to have and continue to have with the company is that it happens in the public, it's an open conversation. When I was sitting only on the side of activism, I was very frustrated. We were very frustrated because there were lots of things that did not receive any answers. We also, our specialty at my organization is also watching what's happening in markets that are important but that are not located in North America or in Western Europe. Because our assumption is that a lot of the very horrible things that happen content moderation-wise start in those, lower radar places of the world and can backlash afterwards in bigger markets such as the US or Europe in general. So the biggest frustration we've had is that we had been sending a lot of, signals to the companies, and not all of these received attention and received responses. Whereas now with those open conversation through the non-binding recommendations, even not receiving an answer is very telling. So yes, I would say it's a step further, definitely, from my perspective.
And speaking about looking internationally at Facebook and what's happening, and also thinking about the board's authority, one thing that stuck out to me is that you can take cases from both Facebook and Instagram, but not Facebook-owned WhatsApp. And I was just wondering, how do you think about that when you think about how widely WhatsApp is used internationally, and why doesn't the board have authority over those cases?
Oh, wow. So, first of all, I would like to say that the whole conversation on moderating encrypted platform is very heated at the moment because we do not want to undermine, at least at Internet Sans Frontières, absolutely not want to undermine privacy, the privacy features that come with encryption. But at the same time, yes, it's a big challenge because a lot of messages are being forwarded with a lot of disinformation, misinformation, especially with the pandemic. So that being said, it might seem easy. We usually get questions around, yes, why don't you take this and why don't you take that? We have to think that it's, from a technical perspective, very difficult to implement an appeals process that gives the board access to very confidential information, while at the same time protecting the privacy of the people who appeal and the users in general, and protecting the stability of the whole infrastructure, social media infrastructure. So I'm not a technical person at all, but I would suspect that the encryption layer adds difficulty. That doesn't mean that nothing is being done when it comes to moderating on encrypted channels. We, for instance, at Internet Sans Frontières, we had a program that tracked hate speech and disinformation on social media in general, including on messaging apps, WhatsApp particularly. And one of our methodologies has been to basically have people within the big groups that are, more or less known in the context of each country, more or less known for spreading hate or disinformation. And that has been very helpful, at least to know the type of disinformation that comes within those groups, and also very helpful to bring counter messages. That's very helpful to bring within those groups and within those platforms counter messages to help people decipher, yes, I wouldn't say truth from false because that's another debate, but at least having another perspective on information that they receive, like that. Another aspect that I think is important to talk about when we talk about disinformation and encrypted platform is the digital literacy is extremely important. We do not realize how difficult it might be in places around the world where information was controlled for years by only one group of people, and suddenly transitioning from that to a world where you receive information all the time, 24/7, it's very challenging. And the amount of criticism that you need to have with regards to information that you receive is not something that's so obvious. So I think, yes, in this debate on encryption and disinformation, we need to look at digital literacy as well, beyond the technical responses that we can think of.
Michael, do you have any response to that, and just in thinking about whether the Oversight Board should have jurisdiction over WhatsApp?
Well, I think of WhatsApp as being a very different kind of platform, and it may very well be that at some point we would have a useful role there, but it would be quite, I think of it as being, a little foreign to what we do. But may I answer the question in a somewhat broader way, because it may be, a lot of people don't realize just how limited the scope of the board is. And I think a lot of the press coverage, of course not the Washington Post, but other major newspapers that shall remain nameless, it describes the board's jurisdiction in a very sort of capacious and undefined way. But in fact, there's lots of stuff that goes on at Facebook that is not within our jurisdiction. We don't have jurisdiction over paid advertising, for example. As we started out, our jurisdiction was over only user appeals where their content was taken down. Now, already, the first big expansion in our scope was to include third-party objections to material that's being left up. So this is where the misinformation and hate speech and things of that sort become more important. But that was in addition to our jurisdiction. A couple of other things I would like to see, before WhatsApp, which I think is a little bit, it's really a different kind of animal, but with respect to Facebook and Instagram, I think I have learned from public reaction that it isn't actually the content take-ups and specific takedowns and so forth that really bothers people. It's account level actions by Facebook, where people's entire account is frozen for a month or longer than that, and this is not just important for communication; it's also important for business. My favorite example: I just got contacted by a fellow who is a Benjamin Franklin impersonator. I don't mean that in a bad sense. I mean, he's goes to schools, and he used to work at Williamsburg as Benjamin Franklin, and so it's and his entire business was shut down because of inauthentic behavior. Now, that's just silly, but the underlying problem at Facebook is there's nobody at the other end of the phone for him to call and get his problem solved, right? And multiply the Benjamin Franklin impersonator by 10,000, and you have lots of communication, political, commercial, otherwise, that is being suppressed with basically no way to. I'd like to get our hands on that, right? And then another thing that we do not have jurisdiction over that makes a lot of people quite nervous is the. And this has to do with the misinformation and disinformation space, but the fact-checking process, which that Facebook uses, is something that we don't review. And yet, this is something. If you ask people what they think is a problem at Facebook, that's on a lot of people's lists. So now it is I expect that our scope is going to be increasing. In some ways, it's maybe a good thing that we start out with a narrow scope and build up, because this has never been done before, and I think that we're learning and we're getting better at it, and I think as our capacity to do more and better work increases, I expect that the scope will increase, and maybe at some point even WhatsApp, although. It wouldn't be on my list of the most important priorities.
What would be on your list, Julie, of the most important priorities?
I would completely agree with Michael about the account suspension problem. For the public information, I receive very often messages through LinkedIn, Twitter, any network, about people who have lost literally everything. It happens to users in the US, and it also happens to users in, places where really making money through your activities on Facebook is a matter of life, or I wouldn't say death, but it's extremely important for people. So I would say this is something that's preoccupying. Also, another very important priority for us at the board is that we really we hope to be able to reflect the globality, basically, of the issues that are at stake here. They don't only happen in North America or in Europe, as we might be tempted to think, but they happen around the world. As a matter of fact, more than half of the 17 cases that we've worked in, that we're currently working on, involve issues in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So for me, this is a priority because we're talking about, places around the world where, yes, there is no other mean of accountability and of appeals than, other than the board, basically. And yes, that for me would be an important priority for us to work on.
Given that, what are you doing and what steps are you taking to scale the impact of the board's work since you can only take on, several dozen cases in a given year?
That's a very, very important question. So it's true we've only taken 17 cases out of the 500,000 appeals that we received so far, if I'm correct. But the priorities of the board, we take cases that have the potential not only to impact the user who has appealed or the user concerned by the content, but also different other users in similar cases and policies, involving quite similar policy issues. And with that, I would say the impact has been quite interesting through the, first of all, implementation of our binding decisions, but also through the voluntary implementation of our recommendations by the company. Those implementation potentially have the potential to impact the whole platform. These are technical tweaks that we're talking about, like major ones, and I think that's the scalability aspect of, what we can do from a scalability perspective. Also, what I would like to note is that we are currently 20 members, so the board launched with 20 members, but theoretically we could expand up to 40 members according to our bylaws. Expanding the membership of the board would help us take over much more cases and also help us speed up a bit, the process. So there are different ways to reach the scalability, preoccupation that you just mentioned.
And one thing with scale is the company has said it will implement the board's decisions across content that is identical and made with similar sentiment and context. And so I just wanted to ask you both, is that happening right now, and how can you at the board track that?
I'm going to throw that
Yes.
to Julie.
Oh,
This is
I was about to throw that to you,
an implementation
Michael.
committee question.
Yes, no, we are currently developing metrics to be able to measure the efficiency, or at least the implementation of our recommendations. We have very frequent discussions with the Facebook teams that involve not only the policy people but also data scientists, product, and many other sectors within the company. So we are developing metrics, and we'll have our first ever transparency report that will come out at the end of this year, and that will include a lot of this, metrics and data that we're currently working on gathering. So there are ways to measure that, but we work with Facebook on that.
So can I just add to that this is not just an engineering question, that applying the same rules consistently across like cases is absolutely fundamental to a system of free expression, right? So it almost doesn't matter what the rules are as long as they are being applied consistently, fairly, the extreme would be, if one party is being regulated, with great intensity and specificity, and the other, quite loosely. Doesn't matter what the rules are. That's just going to lead to unfairness in a way that seriously impacts freedom of expression. So I think it's going to take some time for this to work out, because it's like we're the people sticking our toes in the swimming pool, but as we get farther down in, right, and are looking at larger numbers of cases and bringing consistency and transparency to this process, I really do think that this is one of the most important sort of philosophical or jurisprudential aspects of what we do, because prior to this, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm being unfair here, but I don't think there was any sort of systemic way for Facebook even to be thinking about the consistency of its enforcement of its standards. And now we are paying a lot of attention to that, and I think it may be one of the most important things about what we do.
And I wanted to ask you on that point of that you're just kind of sticking your toes in the water and how this is a new experiment. Obviously you had a very early high-profile test when you were tossed the Trump case just months into operations. I mean, do you feel like you were ready for that case?
Well, it would have been better if that had been down the road a little bit. But there was no doubt that with the case happening in the world, we had at least I didn't feel the slightest bit of doubt that we should take it. It would have been like, what are we here for? If we're not going to look at a case of that significance, I think we just would be letting people down. So maybe it would have been nice for it to be later, but I don't regret taking it on.
How about you, Julie?
Absolutely no regrets. Like one of my colleagues, Ronaldo Lemos from Brazil, said once, he said, we just have to, go. We will never be super ready anyway. There's no perfection, so let's just go ahead. And I would say in the process of working on this case, we've learned a lot, really, about, first of all, our capacity to be agile and to adapt to a very stressful environments, and including working on a case that has generated more than 9,000 public comments, because we have, for information, we have a process through which third parties can make contributions, comments on the cases that we're working on. And for the Trump case, we received 9,000 plus. That was challenging not only for the board, but I would say most importantly for the administration that helps us so much. And by the way, I'd like to thank them again for the incredible work that they do in supporting us. But yes, we've learned a lot about ourselves, about our limits, about our capabilities. And also one very important lesson, I think, is one of the criticisms that is always being thrown at us is that, well, the political spectrum within the board membership is too large, from very conservative to very liberal, from certain interpretation. Well, despite those big differences in our opinions, because we're humans and we do have opinions, despite this, I would say the aim of making sure that freedom of expression or human rights in general are the principle and not the exception on a platform such as important as Facebook and also as Instagram. Well, that was a very beautiful lesson for me to see that this is something that really unites us and, yes, helps us work on our disagreements. We do have a lot of disagreements and very interesting discussions, but yes, that aim is, is shared among board members.
And you mentioned you learned a lot from that case. Now, looking back at the reaction to it and the company's response, is there anything you would change in that decision?
Speaking for me, no. Given the reaction, including from, I would say, supporters of the former president, I would say that there was a need to understand what happened behind that door when the CEO of Facebook and his advisors decided to make this important decision. So shedding light on that was extremely helpful for everyone, I would say. If we compare with other platforms, we still are in, we don't really know what happened and how the decision was made, the process that has led to the decision. So with our opinion on this particular case, I think we were able to, open up a bit that black box. I'm borrowing an expression here from our executive director, Thomas Hughes. We've opened that black box of what happened behind that door. Sorry, I'm very emotional. I'm losing my earring. On that January the 7th. So I would say I wouldn't change anything, honestly, but that's just me.
How about you, Michael?
Oh, well, it was very long decision in which virtually every sentence was negotiated, and we worked very hard. There was a particular panel. We don't identify who they are, but then the whole board has its input. And, I probably would change quite a few things in it if it were just me, right? But it's not just me. It's a very diverse global board, and although, of course, I'm right about everything in my own mind, who was it was it John Locke who said, every man is orthodox to himself? But I think institutionally, it's a much stronger and better way to proceed to have a diverse bunch, and that means there's going to be some disagreements, and that means I'm not going to be happy with every sentence in the decision. What I think is really when the Trump case came to us, there was something I knew for sure, which is everybody was going to hate our decision no matter what we did, right? Because almost half the country thought we should order Facebook to let Mr. Trump back on the platform, and the other half of the country thought we should order Facebook to throw away the key, make it permanent, and maybe throw in thumb screws as an additional penalty. So we knew that there was going to be opposition, and I think what we did is, when you're not going to be able to please everybody, we just tried to do what seemed to be right. And in this case, we tried not to make the case, our decision was not about Trump. Our decision was about Facebook and Facebook's consideration of the Trump matter. And so when they threw him off the platform indefinitely, with no clue how long that was going to be or what the criteria were going to be, this is not the way decisions of that sort ought to go. And so what we did is we did not tell them, we didn't impose what we thought should be the correct result for Trump. Instead, we threw it back to them and said, do it right. And they took it back and they redid it, and they had a definite period of time, and they gave an explanation for that. And people aren't happy with that either, because of course it's not going to please anybody no matter what. But I think the temperature of the whole matter did go down as a result of the process, and that's no small achievement.
So on that point about timing, Facebook has said that Trump can come back in January 2023, but he can only come back if, quote, the risk to public safety has receded. Do you see the board playing a role in helping the company determine whether it's safe or not for the president to return?
Not in the first instance. I assume that they're going to be deciding that on the basis of actual information about who's organizing, what kinds of protests and so forth. We are not frontline decision makers. We're more like, I'm a law professor and former judge, so I use judicial analogies. We're like a court of appeals. We're not like the police department.
I agree with that, and I don't even think it would be, that productive, because, like Michael just said, we're not on the front line, and so we do not have all the real-time information in a very thorough manner that would allow us to give the most appropriate advice to the company with regards to that. So I would say, yes, it's more of an operational decision. And we are here mostly to give guidance that are guided themselves by human rights preoccupation and freedom of expression particularly.
And I wanted to ask a little bit on this idea of the role of the board. One of our questions from Slido comes from Anonymous, but it says, I've heard a person call the board the, quote, Facebook Supreme Court. How else should the press describe it?
Can I go? So one French journalist called it a legal UFO, un ovni juridique. So I found it very interesting. Other people say it's an experiment. I also find it beautiful, especially in this time of history in which anything is possible. Don't know about Michael.
Well, the Facebook Supreme Court is a little grandiose description for my taste. I'd rather call it an industry self-regulatory mechanism.
Got it. And so looking back on the decisions you've made so far, what changes has the board forced at Facebook that you're most proud of? Julie, if you want to go first.
Yes, so I mentioned it earlier, and it's definitely the Facebook Transparency Center that adds a very meaningful layer of disclosure, of transparency that for companies such as Facebook was necessary and honestly quite timely, in my opinion.
How about you?
You know, it's hard. I tend to think of this case by case, but you know, there was a case that I don't think got a lot of attention, and so I'm going to mention it, which was a satirical cartoon about the Armenian genocide, in which someone with a Turkish flag was and sweating. You've seen this. This is a kind of common meme, but where there were two buttons. One is the genocide didn't occur, and the other is they deserved it. And so that was taken down by Facebook on the ground that it was hate speech, because on the theory that somehow, basically they didn't get the satire. That's the point. And satire is actually a very important part of discourse. And Facebook had no real way of dealing with that. And so, I thought the case is important because it called attention, and Facebook is trying to institute more human review, and especially with people with the proper language and cultural context to be able to evaluate it. Satire is one thing that algorithms cannot do, right? And so I liked that. Now that's a small thing, but making the world safe for satire it was a good day's work.
So based on the work that you've done so far, do you think other companies like Twitter, TikTok, YouTube should implement their own similar oversight boards?
Wow, that's another very interesting question that we're being asked a lot. So I can't speak for TikTok or any other company, by the way, not even Facebook. But again, as someone who has been very active on these issues with an organization working to safeguard freedom of expression, I think we're at a crossroads basically for freedom of expression, and that crossroad is very linked to the need for more transparency and discussion about how the decisions are made when it comes to, some say it's censorship, some say it's, companies implementing their own rules. It has an impact on our freedom of expression, the mere existence of that freedom that's so important around the world, especially in countries that are very thirsty for more democratic principles and that have been able to achieve some level of democracy thanks to yes, tools such as social media platforms in particular, but the internet and the openness and the access to information that it allows. So yes, I would say we are at a very important moment for freedom of expression, where more transparency is necessary for those who are, yes, deciding what we can say and cannot say on the internet, or at least on social media platforms.
My general view is that any entity with power and discretion, it's better off if there's some kind of, if somebody's looking over their shoulder. But I think there are a lot of different mechanisms for that, a lot of ways that can be done. So I'm not sure that this particular model is perfect. I'm sure it's not perfect, in fact. I do hope that these, the other organizations, other social media companies you're talking about, are thinking about ways to improve their own operations. But whether it is to create, the TikTok Oversight Board, to evaluate teenage dance moves is the way to go, or something else. I don't know. But I have heard it suggested that some of the companies should sort of actually adopt this oversight board as their oversight board too. And I think there's a difference of opinion among people on the board about that. But I hope they don't, because I think it's good to have different approaches. Nobody knows the right answers to all of this, and I'd rather, if we had a competitive, like if the TikTok Oversight Board were out there issuing opinions, we would then, there would be a kind of conversation about what best practices are, what really matters, and so I'm kind of anti-monopoly, and this, as in, I'm looking here at the country's greatest antitrust scholar. So anti-monopoly will, I think, is the better course.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for our panel today. I want to thank you both, and maybe we'll be back talking about the TikTok Oversight Board in a couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat.
Thank you so much. That was great. Media panel coming up.